Welcome to the Wagon Wheel podcast. I'm Jarrod Kimber. With me is Bharat Sundaresan. You can find us both on Twitter and all the other places we are. Probably the Adelaide Hills. I was in South London today. In fact, I saw Sam Curran on a bus. And not the Sam Curran, just a picture of Sam
Oh,
Curran.
right.
Although, weirdly, Surrey had decided, or the Oval had decided to celebrate their star T20 player by putting a photo up of him clearly constipated on the side of a bus. But maybe that's how you get interest with the kids in domestic cricket. But we will start with your questions. I should remind everyone, if you want to, if you're listening on YouTube and you're listening live, you can send us a super chat. If not, the best way to get your questions in is via Patreon, like Niran has. He says, do guys like Michael Lum, Craig Kieswetter, and Luke Wright have a place in history when discussing the English white ball revolution? It's a really interesting one. I think Michael Lum certainly played in a way that got a lot of attention for a little period of time, and then he just wasn't that player after that. Craig Kieswetter was a fantastic player, and obviously, the injury that he had was devastating, and I think people have forgotten just how good he was. And Luke Wright didn't have the same kind of dramatic injury, but there was a time when I was doing all my early numbers, Luke Wright was probably one of the best T20 players in the world because he could bowl you 4 overs pretty regularly and could open the batting or, bat in the top three and probably bat 6 or 7 for certain teams. He for whatever reason, didn't quite get the IPL opportunities he should have. And then when his back went, he couldn't bowl anymore. And his batting was fine, but there were other players, and he was probably moving on a little bit as well. Didn't quite have the power he had when he was younger. I think they're all great players. I don't think they're going to get starring roles in the discussion on white ball revolution just because there were all those people you've named. There were other players doing similar things in English cricket who then went on to do it for international cricket.
Yeah, I mean, and the fact that we're talking about three guys who played such a big role in England winning that World T20 in 2010, and the fact that very few people speak about England's T20 World Cup
Mm-hmm.
win in 2010 because it's just dismissed as a freak occurrence, right? It is to England's T20 cricket what that famous, or I mean, at least famous if you were watching it in the subcontinent, Sharjah win in 1997 was, like, under Adam Holyoke. So that's an experiment or an adventure that English cricket just forgot very quickly. I mean, I thought that was fun, right? When they brought together the likes of Matthew Fleming and Ian Elam, and no, was it Ian Elam? No,
Mark Elam.
Mark Elam. Oof, Ian Austin. That's right, Ian
Mark Elaine. Did
Austin.
Mark Elaine play in that one as well, mate? No, maybe
No,
in.
Mark
Okay.
Lane came just after. So
Yeah.
this is Ian Austin and Peter
Well, I think
Martin
if
and
you look at World Cups, we don't like Australia. No one talks up Australia in 1987,
yeah,
right? They talk up the run, right, from
yeah.
1999 through to 2007. And England have already had that run, not quite at the same level as Australia, but they've already had that kind of run. And even outside of India, 1983 isn't given that much credence. With their first two West Indies things, the truth is that until 2012, I'm not sure we had a real World T20. That's not
Hmm.
saying that Pakistan and India and England
Yeah.
didn't play good cricket to win, and there were other teams who played good cricket at times. It's just that we didn't even, no one took it seriously. Like, Australia rocked up an hour before that
Hmm.
first tournament, right? There was all sorts of weird stuff going on. Michael Clark was playing with a strike rate of 12 for Australia in a final. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that Michael Lum, Craig Kieswetter, and Luke Wright weren't good players, because I think they were. But there's a big difference between Mike Valletta
Hmm.
and the
Damon Martin.
yeah, Damien Martin or Brad Hogg or those sorts of
Yeah.
players later on, right? They're thought of, very high up, whereas Mike Valletta, I'm the first person to say Mike Valletta's name outside of his family or friends in the last month. And he was a fantastic player, right?
He
But it
was.
was
Yeah.
just the wrong era.
Yeah, and look, you're right about Craig Kieswetter. I thought more than T20 cricket, because the question does involve ODIs as well.
Hmm.
I thought he had the potential to be an ODI great for England from an English perspective, and where England's 50 over cricket was back then. In terms of history as well, right? I mean, England is interesting, right? They played so much white ball cricket domestically, but you look at their numbers overall, because they haven't played enough ODIs historically. Now I think it's changing with the last 5 or 10 years. What the highest run getters are still in the 6,000s and the 7,000s.
They're way lower than everyone else, aren't they? I think
Exactly,
Joe
yeah.
Root's caught them a little bit, but even those guys get rested a lot now, so even they're not quite up
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do. So if Craig Teaswetter doesn't get injured, he has a longer
Yep.
run. Yeah, I mean, he was a big threat to Matt Pryor, right? He kind of took over from Matt Pryor in the white ball setup, and he could have had a long career. I think Michael Lum, when you talk about the IPL as well, this is that early period where it felt like the only IPL team was ready to invest in uh, non-big name English players were the Rajasthan Royals, right? You speak of Dimitri Mascarenhas, of course, he was Shane Warne's best friend or one of his best friends, so that helped.
He's on the
Even
mural.
some was that
He's in the mural.
he is, yeah, and even someone like Tyrone Henderson, for example. I mean, all right, he's South African, but he has that good run for Middlesex in the T20, whatever it was called back then in England. He gets a call up. Michael Lum was similar. I don't think he got a long enough run. He played a few games here and there, and
He had a very good strike rate, I think, but didn't make the runs. And back in those
Yeah.
days, it was probably before, we kind of gave credit to those. I remember having a fight with Grant Elliott about it on Twitter at once, where because everyone hyped up Michael Lum, and I was
Yeah.
like, look, I'm fine with that. But at that stage, he was averaging 19. I think the day me and Grant Elliott had a fight, he made 80. So he did make a bit more runs. But yeah, look,
Yeah.
I think Kieswetter is the one. I think Luke Wright was probably slightly too old, and I think Michael Lum was slightly too old from that perspective of they were coming to the end of their use. And we've seen lots of players like that come through before where just wrong place, wrong time. Patrick says, have we seen who Crawley is yet, or is it possible he still might become what England thinks he can be? Look, Crawley is tall, gets on top of the bounce, and can drive the ball in a ridiculous way, which should be very good in Test cricket. But he has so many other flaws, and he doesn't know how to consistently make runs. He's never learned how to consistently make runs. I can't see how he's going to do that at Test level now. I'd much rather he disappear. They say to him, give us one 1,500-run season in county cricket, and we'll bring you straight back. I just think him playing one good innings every 8... I personally don't see the overall benefit for English cricket in that.
And also, I think the history of Test cricket will tell you starting your career with a huge score can work for you, but it can also work against you. Karun Nair is a different kind of example because he was competing for a spot where suddenly you had a lot of others coming through the ranks as well. But he's not a bad example either. I mean, he gets that 100 very early on in his career, and suddenly you're looked as that guy who got the big score, right? So you do, in Zach Crawley's case, I think he got a longer run because of that innings, because the argument was, oh, if someone can get 260 in a Test match against whatever attack on whatever pitch, he has to be talented. And so that gave him a longer rope than some others.
He was dropped, right? Like England did try and move on from him, and then no one else made any runs.
Yeah.
So if you remember, Renshaw came in. Everyone raved about Renshaw, despite the fact that at that stage, Renshaw was like half a batter. He could only hit the ball in about 3 positions on the field, right? They raved about him. He got dropped because they had other players that they could try, which allowed Renshaw to go up, completely round out his game. Zach Crawley's never really had that. And look, I don't think Zach Crawley is as good a player as Renshaw. I think he has a higher upside, if that makes sense, but I'm not sure he's a better all-round player than someone like Renshaw is. But the ability to go off and do that, it's not quite been the same for Crawley because he's always been around, even when he's not playing, he's been like around the squad or next man in. Whereas, if you go through the great Australian batting lineups or the great Indian batting lineups, those guys could disappear. But then when they came back, they were, it was someone like Murali Vijay, right? Like, a player who would come back, or Mike Hussey, fully fledged, fully functioning batting creatures. Whereas in England, if you're a top order player and you literally know how to do your pads on, you're probably going to be playing in the next Test. And I think Crawley has done that as much as anything. I still think he has huge upside. I just don't think playing him for the next 2 or 3 years. You talked about the high average early on. The other thing is that Roshan Mahanama, and there's a New Zealand player who I forget his name, but he opened early on in the 80s and then came back as a middle order player. I'm trying to remember.
Great Dutch?
No. Rutherford. Ken Rutherford.
Yeah, of course he
right?
did. Yeah.
So Roshan Mahanama and Ken Rutherford, both very, very good cricketers. They both had 2 of the worst starts in Test cricket history, which meant that their averages were really low. It is really hard to get a high average. I've said this about Zach Crawley a long way. If he averages 40 for the next few years, that would actually be fine as the way that Test cricket is going. But he's still going to average like 32 or 33. So if he has 3 or 4 failures, he still could go. We still look at overall average so much, and when someone's picked so young, they quite often have that steeper curve. Ben says, over the course of a decent length career, stats don't really lie, but what players or player were far better and impactful than their stats show, and who has inflated stats compared to their impact? So I think batting and bowling average in Test cricket doesn't lie over a long period of time.
Yeah.
So I think that's fair. I think that's a hard thing to flub. But there are a lot of players around the world who have brilliant batting averages, who happen to start around the year 2000 and happen to retire around the year 2015, 2016, 2017. That's not to denigrate Michael Clarke or Kumar Sangakkara, or I think Yunus Khan might fit in that. Alistair Cook is probably another one who fits in that. I'm not slagging off any of those players because I think a lot of those are absolute great players for their country, and some of those are all-time greats as well. But if you're batting in an era where some years, I think the top 40 average was like 40 per year, which it's never got close to in any other era, you're of course going to have inflated flat stats. And the same with bowling. If you're a 1950s bowlers, a lot of those bowlers have incredible bowling averages because like people were striking at about 1 run and over, and eventually they went out. So there are a lot of 1950 bowlers, there are a lot of 1980s, 1990s bowlers with probably better stats than they look like they're having. And then I think one of the most famous cases is probably the Stuart McGill one, right, where he literally only comes into play when the pitches are spinning. Anyone who ever saw Stuart McGill in a Shield game is not thinking he was one of the greatest leg spinners of all time. They might think he was a very good bowler, but his numbers will help. Those are the ones off the top of my head. There's probably been spinners who play at home as a second spinner and don't play when they're away. I think that would be anyone else. And the other one would be South African seamers in general. South African seamers and Australian and Indian batters over the whole course of their cricket usually have better numbers because batting in India and Australia is better than batting in other places, and bowling seam in South Africa is better than anywhere else. So there's always a natural inflation there, I think.
There is. And then you have exceptional cricketers or exceptional talents who have a good run and then just fade away. And the one name that jumps out at me is Vinod Kambli. I mean, he still averages 54 as a Test cricketer. So if you just look at stats alone, he counts as one of the best to have ever played for India. But that also has a lot to do with the fact that he makes double hundreds in literally consecutive Test matches against Zimbabwe and then against England at home. And his Test career is over literally 2 years after.
Voges you could throw in there. I mean,
yes.
In players like that, you're talking about players who were shafted because there was multiple options or other reasons. In both of their cases, that like with Voges, it's a bit like Dawid Malan in T20 cricket, where with Voges, it was like Australia was looking for a reason to drop him, and they were literally waiting for the first 5 minutes where he failed a couple of times, right? And you do see that sort of stuff. The players that don't always come up, and I've said this a lot, is the sort of Shane Watson, Trevor Bailey, Vinu Mankad type all-rounders.
Oh, for sure.
Where they're not quite guns at either discipline, but when you factor in the fact that they give you an extra batter or an extra bowler, or at least control on the other side, it's actually they're better than they look. So if you look back at Slasher Mackay might be another one as well. You look back at their overall numbers and you're like, oh, okay, they were better than that. I think there's a lot of cricketers like that. The other thing I would say is, and this is in general, that non-Asian spinners usually have worse numbers just because they don't get the ability to cash in. And I think that's a very, very important thing. And first change bowlers, first change seamers, I don't know what the drop-off is. I think it's 2 or 3 runs per wicket straight away. So if you're bowling first change, your figures just aren't going to look as good as an opener. And you might be doing it, in Joel Garner or Pat Cummins' case, just because it's better for the team. Although if those two averaged any less, they'd be in the negative, I suppose. But the point is that in general, right through the history of cricket, first change bowlers don't have as good figures as opening bowlers. They're not cashing in on the new ball. And so those sorts of players are the ones that instantly come to my mind as not being quite as good as their stats probably, show them.
Luke Neil says, Wagner is Neil Wagner is a great example of that. Like, he also depends on what kind of team you play for. Like
Yeah.
then 10 years later, you think of, oh, New Zealand's bowling attack. You'll start with Saudi and bowl, and Wagner's numbers aren't too bad either. But
Well, with
still, like that's
Wagner, if he played with Chris Martin and Ian O'Brien and those guys, he probably wouldn't have
yeah.
had the ability to do exactly what he could do, right? So sometimes it's kind of how you fit in. But you're right. Wagner is going to be looked at as probably a worse bowler than the other guys, whereas actually, in some ways, he was the most important because once they got through the new ball, that had always been New Zealand's problem. Luke Foley says, why did Gary Ballance retire 5 minutes after he returned to play for Zimbabwe? I know there's a big story with this. I haven't been following it, but I don't think the story's broken yet. And I don't, we could only go with rumors. But I think there's to be continued is maybe the best way of putting this, is what I've heard. I don't know if you've heard anything more.
No, I mean, I heard about Gary Ballance being on the cusp of playing for Zimbabwe much earlier than I'd heard anywhere else from a few people who are always in the know of Zimbabwean cricket. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like the Gary Ballance story in the last 3-4 years, it's taken a lot of turns that I don't think many expected. I mean, for example, to start with, not many people expected to be speaking about Gary Ballance in 2023, but here we are talking about him. But yeah, you're right. To be continued is a good way of putting it. I haven't heard much in the last few weeks anyway about what happened with him and Zimbabwe and where he's headed next.
He's a fascinating story because he certainly is a test quality international player.
Yeah.
And the way that it's all fallen apart, that, when Trent Bolt worked him over, I really do think it's fascinating. But yes, sadly, I haven't been following. I've been waiting for it to break, but I really don't know what is going to break exactly. Gary says, now that the World Cup qualifier lineup is complete, who's your favourites to make it through? Going to be a pretty tasty tournament.
Yeah, I look on paper, you just think West Indies and Sri Lanka would make it through just because, I mean, they're the higher profile teams compared to everyone else. But there's been such a strong focus in Irish cricket, for example, about T20 cricket. I don't know where their one-day cricket is. They've had a very tight series against Bangladesh. There are some names that are, someone like Harry Tector is having a great run.
I think their one-day team's better than their T20 team.
Yeah, it always used to be, right?
Yeah.
But then we heard, or I heard during the T20 World Cup that they were really focusing on that format.
They were,
hadn't
you're right.
Really
Yeah.
done too well in that. But now, yeah, it seems to have shifted. And look, I think for the longest time, the problem with Ireland cricket, in my opinion, was at least in terms of batting, it kind of revolved around the same guys. But now there are all of new guys who come through and are having consistent runs, not just flash in the pan like performances. So, which is good for Irish cricket. What they're going to play the qualifier in Zimbabwe, slow pitches most times in that time of the year in Zimbabwe. So, on paper, most teams have a chance. I'm not sure whether the world is ready for a Nepal or a USA to break through and qualify for the World Cup. If that happens, great. I don't mind that, but honestly, in a 10-team tournament, and I might get burned for this online by lovers of associate cricket, Tim Wigmore to start with. I would prefer if West Indies and Sri Lanka break through that. Though Zimbabwe is not too far behind, we saw them play such good cricket last year, and they again another team who have
I think they're
really
interesting,
come
yeah.
together. Yeah, I think they're going to push the other two.
I go against you. I would prefer that I would prefer that Sri Lanka and the West Indies don't make it. Not because I don't like those teams, because obviously I've always been a massive fan, but just because I think that's kind of what world cricket needs. As in, if that happens, we have to then just start admitting that there are more than 10 teams that are any good. We need to start looking at the way we do these things and everything else. So I do think from that perspective, it would be a lot better. Scotland has got a lot of their players are not going to be available. So I don't know if they're a realistic chance. I think Zimbabwe and Ireland are very, very good teams. Yeah. Netherlands, I'm assuming, again, a lot of their better players may not be around. So I think they might struggle. But you get a full-strength Netherlands bowling lineup in. I don't know what squad we're going to see. But if you do, then they've got a real chance as well. So there's 5 pretty strong teams. And then Scotland may not be at full strength when it comes to their bowling lineup, but they've still got a lot of batting talent there. So, look, I just hope that it's proper cricket. And I think that we are getting closer and closer in the way that in football does to us really paying attention to that. And I mean, as a cricket community, not just me and Bharat. Me and Bharat pay attention to everything. But yeah, I think that it's good from that point of view. I would say that Sri Lanka, Ireland, and Zimbabwe are the interesting ones. But if Puran has a tournament, one player that's kind of enough to swing it for the West Indies. We've got a question about Darren Sammy, so we'll come to that one later, and that will be very interesting. But you do look at, I'm pretty sure, is it Yannick Correa has been picked for the West Indies again? Absolutely respect him for his late career rebirth. But when I see him in the squad, I don't think West Indies is on. West Indies is a sure thing of qualifying in the next round.
My only concern is, like, while I completely agree with you, like, personally, I would like new teams to come through and be part of that World Cup. But while you look at it from that aspect, where it will kind of ram the point home that cricket needs to spread a lot more. Because it's West Indies and Sri Lanka, and we know where their cricket's at in terms of administration and the finances. If they don't qualify for the World Cup, you might end up losing them for a while. In terms of that, will have a huge impact on cricket in the West Indies and more so in Sri Lanka. So that also
I agree. But the thing is, that is what professional sport is supposed to be. If you are slipping, you are supposed to go off and actually fix it. And the problem is, if they keep slipping in, like what happened last time, right? How are they going to learn, right? At a certain point, I think these teams need to be doused, right? Ian says, I can't see this happening, but given the doubts about England's top three and the fears of being 30 for 3 fairly often this summer, would there be logic to having a grinding opener like Ben Compton at the top of the order with Crawley or Duckett with then Pope to follow? I mean, yes, they're not going to do it, obviously, as you said, Ian, but I think I'm not having a go at Ben Compton here, whether it's Ben Compton or someone else. If that player is not of the ability to regularly face 100 balls in a test match, I'm not sure you're going to get much of a boost out of them anyway. I mean, Dom Sibley is a fantastic blocker. He still didn't really change England's fortunes, right? And he's probably, in the top 3 or 4 best defensive batters in the world. But he couldn't score, and he couldn't hit the ball anywhere. Ben Compton is maybe a slightly more rounded player, but it's still limited. And if he wasn't limited, he would have just forced his way in a lot earlier. So from that perspective, I don't think that Ben Compton is going to make a big difference. But if they're failing all the time, Compton might be the sort of person they just go, look, give us 100 balls. That's just make sure that Bairstow isn't in with Root when when the new ball's still there. That's all we ask.
Depends on the pitches, though, right? If what we are hearing and what the reports are from England about Ben Stokes asking for flat pitches or fast pitches then you don't need someone like Ben Compton. And I don't see England going that route. I do believe they will be, if not flat pitches, at least pitches which won't be the kind of pitches which we saw maybe some, we've seen them in the last few years, right? Where opening the batting in England, what's the toughest thing to do in anywhere in the world, or the toughest thing to do in cricket. I don't see we'll see pitches like that, which means that you don't need a grinder at the top, especially the way England are playing Test cricket. And now that they already started making a lot of noise about how they're going to play, and it almost sounds like they're going to take it to the next level of whatever you want to call baseball or what. It could be interesting to see how that goes. And then someone like Ben Compton just doesn't fit into that into that setup, because also if you are playing ultra aggressive cricket, a grinder can work against it, right? Because you want your batters not just to hit boundaries, but to take a lot of strike. And if you have someone playing out maidens at the other end, just because he's trying to soak up deliveries or see off the new ball, it affects the momentum of the other batter as well. So how do they bat around him? So that'll be a challenge. So like Ian has said, he doesn't expect it to happen, and neither do I, unless for some reason the county announcement say, screw you, or we'll prepare pitches the way we want to.
We'll have a break here on Wagon Wheel, and we'll be back with more questions.
Our next partner is Athletic Greens. If cricket has taught us anything, it's that green things are good for you.
I take AG1 by Athletic Greens every day. I gave AG1 a try because a while back I was stuck in a studio reporting on New Zealand, England on overnight. When those games went on, I was up early watching India, Australia at around 4 a.m. In between afternoon naps, I had to watch the Women's World Cup. And when all that was finished, I was doing early mornings for Bangladesh, England. Ignoring the fact that there's too much cricket, that's a stupid schedule for a human being as well. And so Athletic Greens was a far better alternative to ice baths. And after taking it, I felt a lot better. In fact, the whole thing probably kept me sane and healthy at the same time. And also being the kind of nutritional drink I needed to survive those hours, and also the 2 a.m. biltong binges I did a few times. Look, I'm not going to pretend I have a balanced diet. So Athletic Greens is how I cover the nutritional basis. 1 small scoop of AG1 with water, and I drink it first thing in the morning each day. Done. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and also 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/Inca. That's the Inca from the end of my Red Inca podcast. So athleticgreens.com/Inca. Check it out now because it is the best green top you'll ever invest in. Welcome back to Uncovered. Jarrod Kimber and Bharat's in the race. And Josh says, Conway seems to have increased his T20 strike rate from 120-ish in the lead up to the IPL to 135 in the IPL. Has there been a significant change in his batting, or am I imagining things? Look, he's had a pretty good strike rate for a long time. I don't think there's anything there, Josh. It's certainly nothing that I've noticed anyway. There was a period where I thought I think teams have, it's a bit like Mike Hussey, whereas I think he's obviously an above average talent, but there was a period where no one knew how to bowl to him. And so his record probably looks slightly better than it was because he came in as a fully grown adult rather than someone like Zach Crawley having to come in as a kid still working himself out. So I would say there was probably that, but overall, I think Conway's he's probably been a fairly quick scorer. He always comes up on my information as a faster scoring anchor. So 135 seems pretty normal to me.
I think when the change happened was when he moves to New Zealand from South Africa. I remember doing a story on him.
Well, that's because he was crap before and then he became good.
Pretty much, like once he reached New Zealand. No. I mean, in terms of crap, like, so he goes to New Zealand, and Sriram Krishnamurthy, who now I think has moved back to India, who was working as a batting coach in New Zealand, was the first guy to really take Devin Conway under his wings and spend a lot of time with him. So I remember doing a story just before his Test debut, I'm going to say. That's right, like a couple of years ago, I think. So one thing he did say was, and Devin Conway is one of those cricketers, right? Like every time you see him, it looks like he's become better than he was the last time, because he's like a Marnus sort of Steve Smith in that sense, or a Kane Williamson, just spends so much time in practice, and he doesn't leave the nets before he's ticked every box he wants. And while he's in the nets, he adds boxes to tick, is what I've heard. I haven't seen much of him since I haven't seen Devin Conway practice, I don't think so. That means I haven't covered New Zealand play Test cricket in a long time. So and so what happens is he moves to New Zealand, and all he wants to do is make big runs in first class cricket. So you see his record in first class cricket in New Zealand. He makes big scores. I think he gets double hundreds and big hundreds, and he has 2 massive seasons in terms of runs. And then he's like, okay, now I need to conquer all formats. I want to break into, and this is when New Zealand seem to have a pretty settled top order when he moves there. But he looks at opportunities in the other formats, and he starts working on his T20 game. So I think he spent 3 or 4 months around 2019, 2020, in that period, really working on his T20 games, adding more scoring areas all around the ground. And that's when he becomes Devin Conway, the all-round batter. And if you remember, he breaks into the New Zealand side in the shorter formats. And then I think he made that 99 against Australia, if I'm not mistaken. Was it 99 or late 90s? He missed out on 100 by a run or two. And then, makes that famous Test debut. And, Devin Conway becomes one of the better batters in the world across all formats. Yeah. Devin Conway.
Josh says, draftception, which draft would you personally have the most fun drafting? Well, we've still got to get around and actually do one of those. But Current test, all-time test, current T20, all-time T20. So we did one on Crick Info with me, Gaurav, I think Matt Rowland might have been on it as well, where we tried to come up with the best T20 players of all time. There's a lot of arguing, a lot of people suggesting Virat Kohli and Dwayne Bravo, and me just being like, no. It's good fun, and I think if you're drafting it in that kind of way, if you did an all-time Test 11, and it was you, me, and Bayram or someone like that, it would be fun to see. Like, obviously, everyone's racing for Imran Khan and Garfield Sobers and Don Bradman, and sort of where you go from there. That would be fun on a historical one. But all-time T20 is a really interesting one as well. So having done it, I don't think there's a bad one. We'll probably come up with best New Zealand all-rounders of the 90s. We could have a great draftception of that as well. It is a series that we're looking to put together. Me and Bharat just have to work it out. It might be something we can do when you're over in the UK. Actually, just chuck them together.
Make it look important. Like have a lot of many sheets of paper and a pen.
Yeah.
So I've literally forgotten writing. I must say.
And then Muku doing a ticker at the bottom, with our stuff. No, look, Josh, it's something we're definitely going to get into. It's something I've been interested in a long time, and I've now convinced Bharat that he would have just as much nerdy fun with it. So we'll get to it very soon. Niran says, who is unlucky at cricketer, Phil Jakes or Brad Hodge? Victorian bias is allowed. This is tough for me because I'm friends with Hodgie. So because I'm friends with Hodgie, I'll say Phil Jakes. Just because I think if you're an Australian middle orders batter, you're always going to come up against 3 or 4 all-timers. Like there's almost, it's very rare that Australia doesn't have, especially a number 4 and 5 who are just absolutely exceptional. They, as a culture, they seem to find them easier than almost anyone else does. Maybe India is the only one that would be close on that sort of thing. Whereas I think with Jakes, also what's he averaging? 47 in Test cricket. He averages about 48, 49 for New South Wales. Does his back and then fades away. Whereas at least Hodge was like, well, look at all these other guys I can't force into. Whereas I think Jake's had kind of proven he was very good. That's how I remember it anyway.
Oh, yeah. And I did commentary with him during the Sydney test this time. Wonderful man, like a very humble. And I really.
And Hodgie is not humble. So that also does.
Well, that adds into it, doesn't it? Like that plays into it. No, but you're right. Phil Jakes between 2006 and at a time when, Justin Langer's gone, Hayden's on the wane, is about to quit or retire from Test cricket. So Australia desperately needed a stable opener, and Phil Jakes was that man. He scored runs everywhere, right? Like all around the world, wherever he got the chance. Unfortunately, doesn't get a chance to play an Ashes series away from home, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't think he played many big series, did he? He played some tough ones and did well. But yeah, look, I think you're right. I think to me anyway, I thought this is a guy that probably we get 3 years of high performance out of. Probably, I mean, his average is probably slightly inflated by the amount of tests he played. But I could have easily averaged between 43 and 45, and been a very, very good player in that way. Hodgie is different. I mean, I first saw Hodgie when he was about, well, I was going to say when he was little, but I suppose he's still little. But I first saw Hodgie when he must have been, was he 16 when he made his debut for Victoria? 17? He looked about 12 when he came out to bat. And that first season, I think he made over 1,000 runs. And it was like, wow. He actually then had a bunch of years where he was in and out of the side. He couldn't get it right. When he gets it right, it's probably late on. I would say, though, he still has a very good Australian career, just not in Test match cricket, right? True. Whereas Jakes doesn't really have one.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, both made. Didn't Phil Jakes make a double hundred as well? I'm pretty sure. So both make Test double hundreds.
Do you make one against Sri Lanka? Am I making that up?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, he does make a double hundred against Sri Lanka at home. So both have Test double hundreds to their name. But I'm with you. I think Phil Jakes, at least in terms of Test, and he didn't have a very bad one-day record either. Phil Jakes. I mean, he didn't play enough. But Brad Hodge is a World Cup winner. He had a long run in T20 cricket. He was for the longest time one of the more successful batters for Australia and T20.
Played until he was 60.
He did. I mean, I think he's still playing somewhere.
I tell you, when we were at St. Lucia, when we started to lose, took everything I had to not to pull him back from putting the pads on. Niran again says, "Oh no, we've already done that question."
No, we've done this, yeah.
Patrick says, "Oh my god, wait,
Wait.
we just got doubled up." Oh, here we go. Swami Nathan says, "Do IPL cricketers get paid the entire auction amount even if they warm the bench? What happens when they leave the tournament early? Also, why do IPL teams pay the fines for misbehaving cricketers?"
Well, I don't think they get paid the entire auction amount if they warm the bench. You have to play an X number of games, which I think has changed. Back in the day, in the early days of the IPL, it used to be 5 games. I'm going to say 5 games.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you get paid the amount or a big amount. And look, a lot of times as well, the amount that you get in the IPL auction, it doesn't. I'm not saying it's
Nominal.
monopoly money, but it's still like that money does. It's not always just direct. I'm the owner, you're the player, you get paid. There's so many other elements that come into it, or so many factors that play into it as well. But yeah, warming the bench doesn't get you paid money. If you
Leaving early, generally depending on your contract, there are some
Yes.
players who might have a contract where they get paid fully. There are other players that will have a pro rata contract. So they'll say, I'm free for 70% of the tournament and you will get 70% of the fee. And that's not just an IPL thing either.
No.
The warming the bench one is more of an IPL thing, although
Yeah,
there are
it is,
other leagues that have that. But if you're leaving the tournament early, that is the case. The IPL teams paying the fines, I'm not sure that's always happened. Is that not? I feel like that's a more of a recent thing, and it's stupid because the idea of fining players is so they're penalized for their own actions. If your team is, I don't really get that, but that seems to be a newer thing to me.
And Swaminathan's question has a lot to do with the recent Virat Kohli Gautam Gambhir WrestleMania bout. I always say just throw them in the cage and they can sort it out. It's been going on. It's one of the longest running individual feuds in cricket. Forget Indian cricket.
Not in cricket. Ian Chappell and Ian Botham still hate each other.
That is true. That's a longer running feud. Yeah. Look, that's more Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan type thing, right? That'll never end. They'll continue till the very end. This is more, I don't know, John Cena, Randy Orton. Anyway, and there is another wrestling reference I'm going to bring in later. I saw one of the other questions. But so RCB did cover for Virat Kohli. It was a big amount if you are like a lowly paid journalist like Jarrod and me. 1.1 crore for saying a few bad words. Imagine if that was our life, Kimber. So I think that, and I don't think every franchise does it. I think RCB has done it, and I don't know. It's.
I thought another team had done it as well recently.
Yeah.
But yes, I think traditionally, I don't think this is a thing. And Virat Kohli is the first time I've noticed it. There might be some other IPL heads around that have noticed it before. But generally, when a player gets fined, they get fined themselves.
They get fined, yeah.
Yeah.
Not that 1 crore would make too much of a difference to Virat Kohli. Let's face it.
Swami Nathan again says, how did Aussie cricket and society move on from one extreme to another, turning a blind eye with Warren and Moore, canoodling with the bookies, to handing out year-long bans for a relatively innocuous ball tampering? So the most important thing to note is that the Warren and Moore thing happens before the Hansi Cronje, Mohammad Azharuddin, and everything else. And so at that stage, I would say there had been fixing going on for quite a while. I think there are lots of stories about it happening in county cricket. There's certainly other stories going on. In fact, I mean, fixing, I think the first public fixing case is 1820s in England. So it's not like Pakistan or Mohammad Azharuddin or Hansi Cronje invented this thing, right? It definitely was going on in between 1830 and the year 2000, right?
Across all sport,
Yeah, no, of course, definitely.
Yeah.
What it wasn't, though, is it wasn't as frowned upon, and it wasn't also, people weren't looking for it or anything else. When the Warren and Moore thing happened, essentially what happened was that Cricket Australia did it on the sly, right? They didn't tell anyone. That's why it happened in the way that it did. There was what was Cricket Australia going to do this time? It was an overreaction. If you remember, the Australian Prime Minister was involved. Yeah. It was a complete PR bullshit. James Sutherland should be ashamed of his role in it, because there's absolutely no doubt that he knew that it was happening well before the Australian team was caught over it. So it was an overreaction. The fact that the bowlers got no penalty It's incredible that they're all walking in with these balls that looked really weird, and at no and they're reverse swinging like crazy. And at no stage did they think, I wonder if, like, as if the bowlers weren't involved, right? As if the coaching staff wasn't involved. So to give a 1 year thing, it was just an overreaction to what happened, and also the lies. But again, that wasn't just the 3 players who were lying at that first press event. It was also the whole Cricket Australian staff were lying at that point. It was an overreaction. It was a mistake, but it was a particular clusterfuck event. The original one was completely different in the way that it was handled. But if you look at the second one, Shane Warne was given the same penalty for failing the drugs code as the Australian players were for essentially lying to the press. Because remember, they weren't actually suspended for the tampering, were they? It was for the lying and the deceit and everything else, which is even, as I said, the whole thing's complete bullshit, because so many people in Australian cricket knew that the ball tampering had been going on and were involved actively in it themselves. And for 3 players to get suspended is just, it was an overreaction to what was a very, very public incident. Remember, no one saw Shane Warne and Mark Ward with the bookie. No one had, footage of them, having a smoke out the back or anything like that. So it was very different.
One of the favorite things about Australian society that I like talking about, and I do it on any medium that I'm given an opportunity on, is how cricketers in this country are held to such a different moral standard as compared to other famous sports people, especially as compared to footy players, whether you're playing AFL or NRL, right? Like, I mean, some of the things that those guys get involved in: domestic abuse, sexual abuse, stalking,
smearing shit on the walls of places, over and over again.
And not just in Australia, they go overseas, they go to America, punch out bouncers, grope women, and a few months later, it's back to normal. He's a star, or he's a star. Which club? I remember someone from Collingwood got into a lot of trouble last year, and
it's never happened, mate.
Yeah, especially from Collingwood, of course.
No, I mean, that was a perfect example. If I remember talking to my family and friends and just being like, well, that's it. We're going to have to get rid of him. And they're like, no, he'll be back. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm thinking cricket. He will be back. Of course he'll be back. He's got a whole off season to rehab his image before he comes back, right? And that's exactly what happened. And he's still playing for Collingwood now. And as you said, the rugby players, rugby league, we should say, rugby union players don't seem to smear as much shit or grope as many women, from what I can tell.
Nobody seems to write about them, just like nobody seems to write about rugby union much in this country. But the rugby league players, the kind of things they do. And if you think about, I mean, again, like I said, terrible things to other people, where other people's lives are impacted for forever. And here you're talking about 3 guys who did try doing something to a cricket ball, and they didn't even succeed. Like, the ball wasn't even tampered with eventually. Like, they didn't even have to change it. So you're punishing someone for doing something so badly to a cricket ball, which had no impact on it. And, they're gone for a year, while like these guys are up to crazy things, right? Like, court cases all around the shop, like, and not just current players, retired players, but a lot of them have media gigs. But when it comes to cricket, Australia is like, no, you can't do anything wrong. You have to follow this moral code, which, it kind of explains why that overreaction happened in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it, I mean, we're getting very Australian on this episode, but it's a really good question, Sammy, Nathan, and because you've asked this question. If you compare it to the Essendon football scandal, right, where the players were involved with supplements. So it was a bit like what happened with the Sky cycling team, where it wasn't doping, but it was like organized cheating around the doping thing. There was a big reaction, but I think the coach actually stayed on for a little while, and I know some of that was contractual and everything else. It's a big difference from Darren Lehman, in tears and everything, and the way that went. All I would say is that pretty much everyone involved has been rehabilitated ever. And if you look at some of the biggest scandals in cricket, like the rebel tours of the English players and everything else, outside of the West Indian rebel players, cricketers have still usually come back, right? There are some players who are too unruly for the system in cricket. So Vinod Kambli
Mm.
might actually, to go back, might be
Yeah.
one of those sorts of people. John Snow's a really good example in English
Mm.
cricket. Uh,
Rodney Hall, maybe in Australia.
I don't know. I think Rodney Hall was probably just slowing down, so they moved him on. But
Hmm.
there's, do you mean of recent times since he started saying racist things? Yeah, Greg
Yeah.
Ritchie and Rodney Hall of recent
Yeah.
times. But during the careers,
Oh yeah.
if you're a good player, generally you do find your way back into the international setup in cricket. But there does seem to be a moral code. Look, I mean, Leslie Hilton was a cricketer, and he was he put to death, I think, for murdering someone. What was the West Indian from Barbados with the big front foot who used to bowl the beamers? Roy
Gilchrist.
Yeah, Roy Gilchrist. Savagely beat his wife. There's plenty of, obviously Terry Jenner, Shane Warne's mentor was in jail. Was it for fraud? I think.
Yeah.
It's not like cricketers are better than other people.
Steve Randall. I'm not cricketer umpire, but
Well, Steve Randall stuff is really, really bad. Anyway,
yeah.
So I hope that answers it, Swami Nathan. And, everyone else can Google the Essendon supplement scandal.
Or the Collingwood player.
No. Aditya says, in your IPL MVP, you liken Sehwag to Viv Richards when it comes to T20, given his real strike rates compared to others. Given his white ball exploits, he's truly a pioneer, would even fit into a modern T20 squad. Why doesn't he feature offer in the ODI T20 GOAT discussion? So I'll tell you a story. I was writing about Andrew Simons. And when I was writing about Andrew Simons, it must have been just after he passed, actually. And I was writing a piece for Cricinfo, and I sent it in to Usman Samiuddin. And I said that when you look at Andrew Simons' strike rate, it really is up there with the best players who've ever struck the ball. Viv Richards is certainly one of those. And I mentioned Vrinder Sehwag. And Usman, who's like, obviously, a god of cricket writing and knows, he's like, I thought Sehwag was a bad ODI player. And it had never occurred to me that people still hadn't caught up with that. That was the feeling back then, because he averaged about, 33 or 35 when everyone else was averaging 50, right? But he was averaging that at a strike rate of about 105, 110, I want to say. Yeah. Like, it was ridiculously higher than what the rate was. And I sort of thought, because in my mind, I've retroactively gone back and gone, I was wrong about Sehwag. He was actually much better than I thought he was. But most people haven't. And when we did this IPL MVP thing, we were just like, Sehwag. So I think we had him as MVP caliber player in 3 of the first 4 or 5 years. No one was saying that at the time. Again, it wasn't the way we thought about cricket. And I do think that it was just wrong place, wrong time. The difference between him and Viv Richards is that Viv Richards did match a very good average with an extraordinary strike rate. So Viv Richards is probably more like Jos Buttler or AB de Villiers in that way. But Sehwag, it's absolutely obvious to me now that we completely underestimated the careers. The two players for me are Shahid Afridi and Sehwag. Now that we know much more about white ball cricket, not just T20, but all white ball cricket, I think we can look back and go, Shahid Afridi could get in the side for 2 different jobs. And with one of them, he was absolutely bang on, one of the better players in the world as a bowler over and over again. And then occasionally, he was the best hitter we had in the game. We sort of made fun of him back in the day. Like, me and Bharat and I'm a 90s kid. He's more an early 2000s kid. We were making fun of Afridi, right? And we were saying things like, Sehwag, he's not even averaging 50. What a dud. I think we just know a lot more about white ball cricket now than we used to.
And with Sehwag, the question kind of answers itself because his test numbers was so great, and the impact he had on so many great moments for India in test cricket during the 2000s. You kind of just you took his wide ball stuff more for granted because of what he did in test cricket. I mean, the hundreds he makes all around the world, the way he takes down Ajanta Mendis in that test match, and so many other innings, like in India, the MCG one in 2003, and so many more. But I think what happened as a result was we focused so much on Virender Sehwag, the test batter, that we kind of were like, I mean, obviously he would. It was almost a question of like, he's so good. He plays test cricket like this. He obviously will be good at white ball cricket. And then you start looking at his numbers and saying, hey, but he's actually not as good as we thought he is. without really looking at the numbers that matter, like the strike rate you said. And we've spoken so much about the revolution in England's Test cricket and who's brought that about. I think Virendra Singh Sehwag did that to Indian cricket. Long time before people even realized it. The way he played white ball cricket. Once he becomes an opener in what the 2002 Champions Trophy in Sri Lanka, and then till then Tendulkar Ganguly was the great opening partnership, right? Maybe the greatest opening partnership in one-day cricket. Once Sehwag comes into the mix, how often did both Tendulkar and Ganguly open together? They had to kind of bat up and down, and then Sehwag became the number one opener in the side. And it's like, when you speak to players who played with him and against him, you kind of realize now retrospectively what an impact he had on not just Indian cricket but world cricket, and not just in Test cricket. I think Test cricket, his numbers are so good that he is one of India's all-time greats. But his white ball numbers, they get compared. But if you look at the white ball numbers exclusively, and in the IPL as well, like you said, when he played for Delhi, and then when he had that run with Punjab, when he had a very good year with them, they are extraordinary.
One thing I was going to say is that I think we have seen attacking players who have struggled in white ball cricket before. Jadeja might be. But Slater was the one I was going to mention. And weirdly enough, I think Slater and Sehwag were almost conflated. Whereas actually, when you go back, you're like, well, Slater didn't work. He literally couldn't play white ball cricket. Whereas that's just not the case when you look at Sehwag. So I do think there was a bit of confusion there. We'll have another break here. And then after the break, we've got a couple more Patreon questions and a couple from the room as well, as I quickly try and find an ad.
A few years ago, I had a panic attack after ESPN Cricinfo made me their global writer. I'd earned that position, but I also felt like a fraud at the time because I didn't really understand how I wrote. I understand that there was a process and gears and different styles and things, but how it all came together felt a little bit random. And so I began to panic like a golfer with a natural swing, worried one day I'd just end up with the yips. And would my career be over? So I took my writing apart piece by piece until I understood it. And then I figured out I could teach others all the mistakes I had learned. So I started an online course where I tried to make it as cheap as possible so people like me would be able to afford it. It's called Fans with Laptops, and heaps of people from around the world have used it so far, from first-time writers all the way through to professionals trying to improve. I started with a simple plan to make each writer the best they could be. And from the feedback I've received over the years, it seems like the course does that. But after COVID, my career changed. I came to YouTube, started podcasts, wrote emails, and formed a new career on my own going forward. So I now had something else to offer, the multimedia side of things, social media and everything else. Not to mention that I was building everything up as an independent. And so I added all of that to my course. So if you have ever wanted to work in sports as a writer or podcaster or making videos or anything else, Fans with Laptops is the place to start. If you think you qualify as a fan and you have a laptop and you want to work in sport, click on the link.
Welcome back to Wagon Wheel with Jarrod Kimber and Bharat Sundaresan. Sorry, that question. I think we've got some doubles in our questions. Sorry, everyone. They keep coming up. Just want to shout out to the chat as well. Swami Nathan's in the chat. All Things Cinema Vodcast. Keshuv, Crick Freak, EKG, Canadian Enthusiast, Satya, Frog Skull. And Naren's in there. He said Jake's made 150 versus Sri Lanka. Close enough.
Oh, that's right.
Shorts Tequila said it's 4:18 in India. Always happy when people tell us what time it is in various parts of the world. We'll just get through a couple more here, and I'll go into the chat at the end because there's a couple of questions I want to get to there. That's a question we've already done, haven't we? Emran says, do you think the wobble ball's impact on modern red ball cricket has been largely negative or positive? I feel like the delivery has largely reduced the skill of bowlers. I get that, yes. And from a batting perspective, if the ball is wobbling consistently, there's very little the batters could do until it stops wobbling. And by then, you're usually 80 for 4 or 5. Look, Emran, I'll put it this way. I 100% understand why you've said what you've said and everything else. What I would say is that batters deserve everything that comes their way. And we had a period from 2000 to 2016 where there were more runs scored than there really had ever been in a 15-year period in the history of Test cricket. And there was always going to be a correction to that. This has probably been a slightly more full-on one than we thought it was going to be. And I do get your point with the skill. What I would say is that now we have players who can bowl swing and wobble ball, which wasn't quite the case beforehand. We now have players who can get the ball to wobble in both different directions. And swing bowling is still very important in different ways. So I'm not as worried from that point of view. And I think batters will do what they always do. There was if you go back, they literally said that the wrong un was ruining cricket in 1920s. Right, that we've always, every time the bowlers work out something new, people go, "Oh no, our poor batters!" Batters will work it out, and then in a couple of years' time, we'll be complaining again that the batters are on top.
Yeah, and the only annoying thing about the wobble ball though is it's used a bit too much in press boxes. I'm sure you heard it, Jarrod. Like now, people, or journalists who want to sound intelligent, just shout out wobble ball, like, or wobble seam, like when they think they're not getting enough attention.
It's not just that. I would say the biggest problem with it is, I was watching Mukesh Kumar bowl today, and he bowled a ball where the seam wobbled. But I'm absolutely 100% sure it was accidental. And there's no way of tracking it, right? There's CricViz can't do it. I'm not even sure with the rotation of the ball. If we had advanced technology, we might be able to work it out. But even then, it's a bit tricky. It's hard to see it in the same way it is in other ways. I've had two professional bowlers who both can bowl it, arguing over whether someone has bowled one or not. So I do get that sort of thing. And also, Imran's point of that it makes cricket a little bit more one-dimensional from a bowling perspective. I think it did originally. As I said, I think that is moving on a little bit. But I don't think Imran understands that most bowlers can only bowl one delivery and a straight delivery anyway. So it's like wobble ball and a straight ball, whereas before it used to be an outswinger and a straight ball. Yeah. There aren't that many bowlers at the top level who can do, multiple skills. And the ones who usually do are either geniuses or all times great. So, look, I understand why it's frustrating, but if we both started covering cricket where literally you could not take a wicket, right? This has been a far more interesting time for me. Are you bowling one now?
No, I'm just trying to align it with the camera, and I'm struggling to do that. So just to explain wobble ball,
I'll move Emran's question so you have your full frame now. This is also an audio podcast, so maybe.
Oh really? Oh sorry, I thought this is only on video. So all right. If you are listening to this, I have a cricket ball in my hand with a pretty pronounced seam. I think it's what ball is this? I don't know. It doesn't matter. So I must have stolen it when I was umpiring a game, and I never gave it back. So. That's your. So I'm just explaining what a wobble ball is.
This is the worst segment I've ever been involved in.
So that's how you hold a cricket ball when you just want to swing it, like your fingers on either side of the seam. With wobble, you kind of spread your fingers apart, and you kind of release the ball and don't use your wrists much, so that it kind of wobbles in the air, and with the hope that it kind of lands on the seam and then does something. And then Jimmy Anderson started swinging the wobble seam ball. The way I would explain it in layman terms is it's like when you're playing video games, right? I haven't played a PlayStation in more than 12 years, so I'm sure things have changed. But with the joystick, I'm sure, Jarrod, even say you're playing a soccer video game, you suddenly press that button accidentally, which you haven't before, and you're like, ooh, this happens, and then it becomes your go-to move, and you keep doing that. I think that's what happened with the wobble seam ball. Once Jimmy Anderson brought it into vogue, a lot of bowlers realized that in conditions where nothing's happening, maybe I'll just start pressing that button, or in this case, spread my fingers a little more and start releasing the ball and see what happens. And then it just becomes a trend.
It's an interesting ball because it is tough to go between a wobble ball and a conventional ball. A bit like how baseballers don't throw knuckleballs and then on pace balls. They have trouble with that. Whereas in cricket, it's so far anyway, going between the wobble ball and a normal ball, has only a couple of players have really mastered that ability. Your fingers is right. It's wider on your fingers. It also, that the seam is not quite exactly the same. Like the idea is that that the seam doesn't come out dead straight. For whatever reason, it seems to veer back violently and sometimes veer away violently, depending on the bowler, in a way that normal seam up deliveries don't. And then, of course, it then has one where it just fades back, and then it has the other one that goes dead straight. So you kind of had three options all the time. But it isn't. The important thing to say, Imran, is it isn't just the wobble ball that's changed. Bowlers started bowling fuller and they started bowling wider on the crease. And all of those things meant that the angle, every ball is now hitting either the top of off or the top of middle. Whereas if you grew up watching cricket in the 90s or the 50s or the 60s, it was well outside off stump.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And a lot of that to do is also with DRS and everything else. So the wobble ball is almost a perfect invention for this modern form of cricket. If you had bowled it in the 80s and 90s, you wouldn't have got any LBWs because you would have been coming wide of the crease. And the minute you came wide of the crease, the umpire would have said not out. So a lot of things have changed in that time. Plus, seamers never used to get as many LBWs, just in general. Probably because and different things happened. The West Indies started bowling shorter and all sorts of things. But it's not just the wobble ball has changed. I think is the most important thing to note. But it definitely has changed. Simon Atham, he's all over it. Do you think becoming a T20 journeyman will make talented but troubled Indian cricketers like Prithvi Shaw have long and fruitful careers? How does the economics of that decision making work? Do the riches from the CPL, BBL, 100 and PSL combined make up for the IPL? So, okay, CPL, BBL, 100. Let me try and work out these numbers. That's 400, 500, 560. Let's throw Major League Cricket in there, 700. You would have to have almost maximum contracts in every single one of those tournaments to make up what is a sort of a good contract in the IPL. And the other thing is, and you might know more of this than I would, Bharat, you would also miss out on several sponsors.
Yeah.
So which is where the real money is. If you're not famous in India, so what is it? It's a top-level Indian cricketer gets $100,000 to open a supermarket for an hour's work, right? I think that used to be the mark a couple of years ago anyway. It's probably gone up since then. So a mid-level cricketer is getting like $20,000 to open those up. You're not getting that if you're playing in the CPL, BBL, 100 and PSL, right? So instantly, it's not just about those sorts of things. There's so many other deals you're not getting.
Oh, and the fact is that at least for the next few years, even if Prithvi Shaw, for example, wanted to go that route, he can't because you have to break your links with Indian cricket or move to the US like Unmukh Chand has done or some others have, because there's no other way.
And Unmukh Chand wasn't on a good contract, so it's easy for him to leave.
Exactly. Yeah, he had to, to pursue his cricket. So that's not going to happen. But it is an interesting question because, and I was on some show last week, and I do believe that going forward, it might not be the top name Indian cricketers or like those who play regular cricket for India, but it could well be the other outliers or the second or third tier Indian cricketers who play in the IPL, who eventually will start playing in these other leagues. And the only reason I say that is not because the players will have a choice. It's because this BCCI versus the IPL franchise owners, not war, but like the battle that is slowly commencing will kick up steam, I think, in the next few years, where right now the BCCI has the ultimate say on what their players do. And look, we're already hearing about contracts being handed out by the franchises, not just for Indian players, but for foreign players. The Jofra Archer story is broken now, and lots of other players similarly will come into the mix. But I think they will reach a point where this is my vision. The BCCI and the IPL franchise owners with regards to Indian cricketers will reach an impasse where they'll be like, all right, fine, you can use so-and-so players, but you can't use the Virat Kohlis and even maybe a Prithvi Shaw.
Oh yeah, I think that's fair. I think something else will happen as well. It probably won't happen with the player of Prithvi Shaw's talent, but there are plenty of very good American basketballers who don't play basketball in the NBA, right? There's only so many players, and there will be other leagues as well, like the Chinese basketball and the Spanish league that actually offer NBA level players contracts and playing time that might be worth more to them. There are English footballs who don't play in the Premier League, Spanish footballs, etc., etc. So from that perspective, if India keeps building the talent pool that they're doing, then you will get you'll have the S tier players, which is your Kohli type, level players, Sky, Bumrah level players. Then you'll have A tier players, but B and C tier players might get to a certain point where this well, we can actually make this money up, or we can play for someone else, and so I believe that will be the other thing that will happen. Just because if there's so much money in Indian cricket, what will happen is you'll get at the moment you have the sort of the coaching academy type situation where every former Indian player has a farm somewhere with a bunch of nets and is working on stuff. The next system that there'll be a system sort of outside of the BCCI's control, which will be probably, the best 15, 17, 19-year-old players playing for personal sorts of academies against each other. And so the overall talent in Indian cricket will just multiply because we know that the people are there and that the passion is there. That's going to flood into the rest of the market. And so you might get more people who go to America or maybe, maybe they have an uncle in Australia or whatever that may be, all those sorts of things that will do that. I think that'll just be a natural part of it because there's too much talent in India to be actually used just in the IPL, unless the IPL gets to 30 teams really, really quickly. And I don't think that's going to happen either.
No.
All right. We have a super chat from Aditya who says, do you think the LBW laws for a batter playing switch hit or reverse sweep need to be changed to include to not include pitched outside leg, even leg side wide not given? So what he's saying is when you switch to your other form of batting, you are forfeiting the fact that you have a leg stump, right? And you're basically saying I have an off stump on both sides. I don't mind this at all because I think that's part of the reason that the batter is playing that shot at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
And if they want to keep taking that risk, I love I think the reverse sweep is one of the greatest shots in cricket. Plus, I'm good at it, so it's one of the few shots I can actually nail. But I think if I'm playing it, I shouldn't have a leg stump. I should have off stumps on both sides, and I should be able to go out LBW on either side because I forfeited the thinking that I ever had a leg stump at that point. And I also think the leg side wides. I think if we bring that particular rule in, you might get every time someone goes into reverse sweep, you might just get a bunch of crappy balls bowled. So I'm not as keen on that just because I think it has a secondary follow-on. But the first one, I don't care about at all.
And it's something that gets discussed in umpiring workshops around the world all the time. I mean, that's always a topic. That's a given in terms of how it's just a matter of time before that's going to happen. I've heard it so much that I thought that rule had already changed, where if you kind of switch it, get into that position, the leg stump is taken out of the picture. But maybe it hasn't come into force yet. But look, the cricket committee and the MCC seem to be changing the laws of the game on a daily basis. So maybe it's just a matter of time before this comes. But whenever it's a law which impacts run scoring, it takes a longer period of time, as we've learned with cricket, than it does if it's going to favor the bowlers. So you'll have to wait for.
Don't know why that is. It must be.
No wonder.
Must be a reason. If only someone knew. Don't put that in the comments, by the way, if you're on YouTube now. All things cinema vodcast. He came up with this. I actually thought it was one of the Patreon questions, but I just realized it was in the normal chat. But he said, I wanted to know your thoughts on Darren Sammy as white ball coach, especially with the World Cup qualifier, World Cup, and the T20 World Cup in the next year. I worked with Darren Sammy, obviously, in St. Lucia, know him quite well through that. I think, for me, he wasn't even a captain when he was at St. Lucia, and yet he's the sort of person that's involved in kind of every detail. Those sorts of people with that kind of energy that he has is quite often make good coaches. Look, as I said, Yannick Karai is in the lineup. It's not. I didn't look at that World Cup lineup and be like, well, they're definitely going to qualify for the tournament. I also have seen him work at times in the PSL and I think some of the other leagues I think he's been involved with. I haven't seen anything revolutionary from him. I thought he was a brilliant tactician as a player and a very clever user of his own skills in T20 cricket. And to maximize himself to play as much international cricket as he did, I think he was very, very clever. I'd be shocked if there's a huge boom, though, for West Indies cricket just because he's coach, based just on the squads that they're picking, not based on the fact that he's a good or bad coach.
I've known Darren Sammy a long time. 2010 or 11 is when I got to know him. And Darren Sammy, the person, has evolved since then. He was almost not comfortable being West Indies captain in terms of the attention that he got as a result of it. This is way before he started playing in all these leagues and he became a global T20 sensation. So 2000, before they'd even won their first T20 World Cup. So, and if you know anything about Darren Sammy's childhood, so he grew up wanting to be, priest, but someone who I'm going to say my Christian terminology is gone for the toss, but
A pastor?
a pastor. That's the word I was looking for. I don't know why I kept going for priest. So he would, as a teenager, Darren Sammy would go around the island preaching. And one thing about him is he is very, very good at bringing people together, which he would have done as a pastor as well, and he did definitely as a cricket captain and a leader within that side. You look at the history of Darren Sammy, the cricketer. A lot of people maligned him for being an administration man when he took over the captaincy. But through that period, and then when all the big players came back, he held everyone together. And he has the ability to inspire others to bring the best out of themselves. And also, one thing he's very smart at doing is even if, say, there are warring parties within the side, he's very good at making sure that they all rally around, no pun intended, around one point. Like, in 2016, and I would make fun of him. He would keep saying that they are David and everybody else is Goliath. And after every press conference, I'll be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, nobody thinks you guys are not the favorites for this tournament. But he got everybody else to rally around it. So those things he'll do in terms of cricket tactics, and whether he lifts West Indies cricket as a coach, we'll have to wait and see. And Jarrod, I'm really sorry. I'm kind of running out of time. I have a doctor's appointment, so
you were the one who was late, by the way. No one else. One last thing on Darren Sammy, I will say this, is that he's a brilliant politician. And they need a politician, because when Karan Pollard was there, they didn't have one. When Nicholas Puran was there, they didn't have one. They definitely need that. One last question from Aditya, and then missed the man who was already late and has made himself late for his next appointment can go. Aditya says, do you think the cricket is a sport where the name of the sport is used in commentary the most, e.g. good cricket shot, overall good cricket? It certainly happens in basketball. And I think I've got a feeling that it's used in golf. So no, Aditya. But thank you very much for your super chats, for both your super chats, in fact.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard for me and Bharat to say, because we watch so much cricket, and we probably watch one. Well, I watch one sport. He watches dancing in tights that he pretends is a sport. But I would say it's certainly something that does happen in other sports as well. But it's a very interesting question. But that's all we have from Wagon Wheel. As Bharat sending me WhatsApps telling me that he's going to have to pay a fine for missing his doctor's appointment. Thank you very much to everyone for getting involved again. And we will see you very, very soon next week. And we'll be talking about something else. That's all I have.
If you like what we are making here and you want to know if you can help out, well, you can. On top of asking super chats on our lives, you can also support us through Patreon or buy me a coffee. The more support we can get, the better and more videos we can make. On Patreon, there are plenty of other things we offer too, like a Discord server, the chance to ask questions directly, AMAs, and early versions of our recordings. This channel only exists because people like you help support it. We have to buy equipment, software, pay wages, and my mortgage, I suppose, just to make this stuff happen. And if you don't have any money available to spend, it isn't just your money we want. Shares, likes, retweets, comments, subscriptions, the little bell icon thing,